Where rivers meet, history begins. At the forks of the Ohio, what we now call Pittsburgh, empires clashed, nations rose, and a new America took shape. This is the story of Fort Pitt, the frontier and the birthplace of a city. Have you ever visited Fort Pitt or the Fort Pitt Museum? And if you have, what was your experience like?
Yeah, it's been a long time since I was at Fort Pitt. There's not much there. There is the blockhouse and there's the outline of the fort. So there's not a tremendous amount that is there. And of course, what's interesting is the fort eventually was in private hands and then was taken over by the Daughters of the American Revolution before it became a state park. So there's not much left there anymore. And when we think about Fort Pitt, we typically think about Point State Park and we think about all of the events oftentimes in the summertime that take place there. But when you go, there is still the remnants, however small that might be, of what was at the time an incredibly strategically important locale, first for the French and then for the British militaries.
In 1754, French forces constructed Fort Duquesne at the junction of three rivers, a strategic point controlling the Ohio Valley. George Washington's failed expedition to claim the area triggered the French and Indian War, a conflict that would draw in global powers. Historian Fred Anderson, in Crucible of War, describes how this seemingly local clash helped ignite a worldwide conflict, setting the stage for colonial and imperial upheaval.
Okay, so our first question for you today is, why do you think Fort Pitt is important to Pittsburgh's history?
Well, Fort Pitt is important to Pittsburgh's history because it's really where Pittsburgh begins. It's a major site of influence with Native American folks who are here in the region, the French who become interested as well, and the British. But in 1758, it was literally where Pittsburgh begins.
In 1755, British General Edward Braddock's campaign ended in disaster just east of here, near present-day Braddock, Pennsylvania. But in 1758, British troops under General Forbes pushed forward. The French, outnumbered and isolated, destroyed Fort Duquesne and withdrew.
On the smoldering ruins of Fort Duquesne, the British began constructing a new and far stronger fort, Fort Pitt. Completed by 1761, it was named for Prime Minister William Pitt the Elder and became one of the most formidable forts in North America.
Do you think Fort Pitt still plays an important role in Pittsburgh's identity?
I do think Fort Pitt plays an important role in Pittsburgh's identity. I think that it is a landmark that many people are familiar with. It's at Point State Park, which is one of the most popular destinations in the city of Pittsburgh. It's a connection to what is the past of this region and a reminder that not that long ago, this was the frontier. This was, in the 1700s, what European colonists would have considered to be the edge of civilization. And it's a connection for us to an era not that long ago when this was largely wild terrain, and beyond Pittsburgh was considered to be incredibly dangerous territory. And I think it's important to remember that this is one of the jumping off points for Lewis and Clark and for their expedition, that they came here for provisions before they went on their journey. But Fort Pitt itself is the oldest building that continually stands in what is now the city of Pittsburgh. So I think for us, it is a connection to a past when this area was much more wild, much more untamed, much less populated, and was very different, and was also an area that was contested by empires. And that's not something that we oftentimes think about when we think about Pittsburgh, but at one point this was the epicenter of what became what we know as the French and Indian War and what is worldwide known as the 7 Years' War, which is really the First World War.
Architect and historian Charles Morse Stotts, in his book Fort Pitt, Keystone of the Frontier, highlights its advanced star-shaped design, deep trenches, and robust earth and stone bastions.
The power was tested in 1763 when Fort Pitt was besieged during Pontiac's Rebellion, a widespread indigenous uprising against British policies and expansions. The siege is vividly documented in the correspondence between George Washington and Colonel Henry Bouquet, revealing the fort's dire condition and urgent calls for reinforcements. Bouquet's daring march from Carlisle and his victory at the Battle of Bushy Run ultimately lifted the siege and preserved British control.
Okay, our next question for you is, what do you find most interesting or unique about Fort Pitt's history?
Yeah, I think that probably the most interesting part of Fort Pitt is that at one point it wasn't Fort Pitt, it was Fort Duquesne, and that Fort Pitt is going to be built on the abandoned ruins of a French fort that the French had to leave unwillingly, but left because they had no other option. This was the edge of French military occupation, and when the French found it impossible to keep the fort supplied, they had to abandon it, and they destroyed what they could, and then the British moved in. But at the same time, even when the British came in, this was still contested territory between what becomes Pennsylvania and Virginia. And you see skirmishes between representatives of what become Pennsylvania and then what was Virginia over who had ownership of this land. And I think it's a reminder of the importance of the confluence of the three rivers. We maybe don't realize this, but even today, Pittsburgh is still the largest inland port in the United States. And maybe that doesn't have the same significance that it did over 200 years ago, but at one point, this was incredibly strategic territory and incredibly valuable territory because of the confluence of those rivers. And it was an area that was contested between the French and the British, and then between the Virginians and the Pennsylvanians, but it is an area that was deeply significant for military purposes of those two great empires.
During the American Revolution, Fort Pitt changed hands again, this time becoming a stronghold for the Continental Army. It served as a command center for operations in the Ohio country and helped protect settlers from British Allied native forces. Even in these revolutionary years, the fort remained what historian Charles Stotts called a physical and psychological anchor on the edge of the wilderness.
By 1792, as the frontier pushed westward, Fort Pitt was no longer needed. The site was gradually dismantled, except for one building, the Fort Pitt Blockhouse, completed in 1764, survived. According to Stotts, it was later used as a residence, even a stable, before being rescued in 1894 by the Daughters of the American Revolution. Their efforts preserved it as Pittsburgh's oldest building on its original foundation.
Today, Fort Pitt lives on in Point State Park and the Fort Pitt Museum. These institutions bring the past to life for thousands of visitors every year. Through artifacts, reenactments, and education, the legacy described by Fred Anderson and Charles Stotts, a legacy of conflict, survival, and transformation, remains alive and accessible.
Okay, our other question for you today is, how does the Fort Pitt Museum educate visitors about the site's history?
The Fort Pitt Museum educates visitors about Pittsburgh's history in a variety of ways. So we have educational programming that involves school tours and things like that. We have thousands of school kids a year come through the museum. We have docent-led experiences, and we also do exhibits, which are the displays that are housed on the first and second floor. And some of those exhibits are permanent and some are changing based on topics that we think are important. So the current exhibit that's upstairs is called Homelands, Native Nations of Allegheny, and it's specifically about the American Indian tribes who settled here in the 18th century.
Okay, our final question for you is, how important do you think it is to preserve places like Fort Pitt for future generations?
I think it's very important for us in terms of a matter of local history. Fort Pitt is an important location in the American Revolution. It's an important location in the War of 1812. It's an important location in the Lewis and Clark expedition. It's an important location even in pre-revolutionary history, thinking about its proximity to Fort Necessity, but also thinking about its proximity to General Braddock's march and the eventual battle where General Braddock is going to be killed, and of course where some of the myth of General Washington, which wasn't entirely completely a myth, is going to be born from. Washington acts in a very heroic way after Braddock is mortally wounded to be able to turn what was a terrible defeat for the British, but make sure that it wasn't a complete rout for the British either. And so Fort Pitt is one of the lasting physical reminders of the strategic significance of this area in our nation's history over 250 years ago. And the fact that it predates the founding of our nation and the fact that it has a role to play in the founding of our nation makes it incredibly important for the history of our nation. But in terms of the history of this area, it is a reminder of just how old the city of Pittsburgh is, how old this area is, and that at one point the people who came here were frontiersmen and were pioneers and were the ones who were pushing out and pushing westward expansion further in the United States.
Fort Pitt stood at the crossroads of empires, conflict, and change. Its legacy captured in the pages of Crucible of War, the writings of Stotts, and the voices of early leaders like Washington and Bouquet continues to shape how we understand early America. To walk these grounds is to step into a story written in courage, ambition, and the struggle for a continent.